Tonight the moon rises like a careful secret, pale at first and then honeyed at the horizon, a lantern that has followed our species out of caves and into cities while never quite explaining itself. And if you listen closely, you can hear the oldest rumor we share about it, that once there was no moon, and then suddenly there was a companion born, not as a gentle twin, but as the survivor of an ancient violence. And the shock of that thought is older than physics, even as physics now gives it new names like impact, Synestia, and isotopic inheritance, which makes this quiet sphere feel less like a background and more like a confession waiting to be heard. At a certain distance, myth and measurement lift the same finger to the sky, because every culture that lasted long enough to count its winters had to decide what this face meant. And some called it a goddess who kept lovers from madness, some a white stag hunted by the sun, some a rabbit immortalized by kindness. And beneath every story breathes the same realization that the moon is not just decoration, but governance, a clock for tides and a ruler for calendars, a regulator of darkness whose origin dictates our own, which suggests that to ask where the moon came from is to ask why nights have the shape they do. Science steps into this old conversation with a portfolio of proposals that sound like epics disguised as equations. And the favorite tale at the moment is the giant impact, a collision between the young Earth and a body about the size of Mars that we call Theia, a name borrowed from a titaness who mothered a goddess of the moon as if the ancients had been briefed by time. And in this scenario, Earth became a furnace of vaporized rock, a whirlpool of incandescent rubble that cooled into a disk and then into a companion, which is a difficult thing to imagine, and yet explains why our moon is peculiar in being large, bone-dry, and strangely fraternal to the Earth it circles. That fraternal quality is not sentiment but chemistry, because when the Apollo missions returned with samples, the laboratory became a temple where isotopes were weighed like prayers, and the result still startles. Oxygen, titanium, tungsten, chromium, silicon, they match Earth's signature so closely that the moon feels like a child who never left home. And this is awkward for simple versions of the impact story, which expected Theia's fingerprints to show clearly. So the theory adapted, becoming more energetic, more mixing, more like a synestia, a donut of molten atmosphere where identities blur. Yet even this adapts uneasily to data that insists on sameness, which is the kind of dissonance mysteries live for. Meanwhile, the moon looks simple until you learn to look longer, and then it abandons symmetry. The near side spread with dark Maria, where ancient lava froze like lakes, and the far side armored with thick, bright crust as if refusing molten dreams. And under those seas lie hidden weights called maskins that pull spacecraft off their maps like small conspiracies. And under that again lurks a memory of a magma ocean that once covered the moon and crystallized from the top down, raising light plagioclase to float into a crust, while dense minerals sank and brewed pockets rich in radioactive heat, a stratigraphy of fire that still radiates faintly into our nights. If the moon tells a story so complicated, it is no surprise that myths rehearsed their own answers early, because before seismometers, there were songs, and in them, the moon is formed from fragments of a shattered sun, from the skull of a giant, from a pearl stolen by a hero, from a pot of immortality spilled by an archer's wife. And each tale is less interested in precision than in continuity, insists that loss can become a guide and fracture a face. And in that insistence, the myths agree with science more than either admits, because both say the origin is violent and the aftermath caretaking, which may be while looking up feels like remembering a fever that ended well. Strange details burn slowly into notice, like the coincidence that the moon appears the same size as the sun from Earth's surface. A coincidence that makes total eclipses theatrical, beyond reason, and terrestrial science possible in eras that lacked telescopes, because the sun's corona revealed itself only during those brief black disks, and the words coincidence and theater are inadequate for the sensation of standing in a day that forgets its name while birds remake their plans. A sensation our species has ritualized into schedules and warnings, and still treats with a hush that belongs to doors between rooms, which is what origins usually are. Old observers read the moon's knotted cycles with a patience modern life rarely indulges, the nodal precession of its orbit, the Saros rhythm that brings eclipses back in families, the 18.6-year major standstill when the moon rises and sets at its most extreme northerly and southerly points. And to master these rhythms was to trade terror for timing, to turn the panic of accidental darkness into the pride of a predicted one. And in the remains of great houses and stone rings, the geometry persists like muscle memory of a forgotten posture. A posture we will adopt again as we follow the threads that lead from story to spectrum. The conspiracy that sometimes shadows this topic is not the noisy one of hollow moons and artificial satellites, though those have their charm, but the quieter one of selection. How we look where it is comfortable and forget to look where it aches. How we accept theories that arrive with beautiful math and ignore pebbles underfoot that scuff the model's polish. And in this gap between elegance and evidence resides the truth between a corridor where myth's intuition and science's rigor can share a light strong enough to reveal errors without killing wonder. A corridor we will walk slowly so that our eyes can adjust. So let us take the moon as it is tonight, serene and immodest, a record and a regulator, and step into its past, not as tourists, but as apprentices, beginning with the oldest attention we can confirm, the alignments and archives of people who watched until patterns condensed into advice. Because to learn the origin, we have to understand the uses, and the uses are written in stone that still listens when wind moves through it. And stone is generous if you ask without hurry, which is what we will practice now. In that practice, our tools will be both ancient and new, a hybrid of caliper and chant, of measured shadow and simulated collision, because any single method is an impoverishment when facing a companion that has managed to be both neighbor and myth without contradiction. And the only rule we will keep is the one that governs thresholds. Attention before conclusion, breath before word, schedule before celebration. Because the moon has waited 4.5 billion years without explanation, and if it shares one now, it will prefer listeners to judges. Begin in darkness that is organized by courage, because before faith and doubt there was counting, and the moon offered numbers to hands that had not yet written them, a changing face that could be carved into bone and notched into antler and sung into calendars, whose errors could be felt against hunger. And out of this arithmetic arose a geography of ritual, stones set to catch first slivers after new, passages that greet midwinter dawns with one eye and lunar standstills with the other, a choreography of shadow and silence whose architects were farmers and navigators long before they were anything else. On islands scoured by wind, thin bronze bells hang where waves can argue with them, and on plateaus under latitudes where the moon climbs high and then forgets to return for years at a time, people set walls and windows to frame the extremities of its wander. Because the major standstills far northern and southern risings and settings are shy and require endurance to catch, And endurance is what cultures practice when they mean to survive. And in the American Southwest, the spine of a mesa becomes a calendar at Chimney Rock. A stone gate for a moon that only passes at this swagger once in a generation, which means someone stood watch, knowing the result would not be theirs to see. The arithmetic deepened into astronomy, where river empires discovered the trick of writing, and in the clay beds of Mesopotamia, scholars carved tablets that carry eclipse forecasts like recipes, families of shadows tied together by the Saros, a cycle measured in decades that allowed priests to predict their own terror into compliance and thereby to govern. And in far Maya forests, the Dresden Codex carries a lunar almanac so careful it could have booked appointments with darkness. An ancestor to both is the realization that repetition with error is still repetition, and that a truth generous enough to include its own uncertainty is a kindness, which is how lunar science began before the word science existed. China's astronomers recorded guest stars and trembling suns while keeping eclipse logs so severe that emperors hid when the dragon returned. And in India, the moon threaded itself through nakshatras, the lunar mansions that parcel the sky into steps a journeying mind can climb. And whether these steps were used for birth charts or harvest schedules matters less than the discipline they taught, that heaven is a system with tolerances rather than caprice, and caprice is smaller than a system even when it roars, which is the sort of lesson that migrates from temple to laboratory without changing its shoes. The Greeks argued with elegance and ambition, building models that dared to explain both the moon's phases and its distance. And while their spheres did not keep faith with reality for long, they enshrined a habit more important than any conclusion. They drew diagrams that could be wrong gracefully, and these diagrams survived longer than empires, because a diagram is a boat that can carry additional cargo. And into this boat later, thinkers loaded the first physical origin stories, fission, capture, and co-accretion, each a way to imagine how a small world could become bound to a larger one without being devoured. Fission had its hour when a geologist suggested the moon might be a piece of Earth slung off by a young planet spinning so quickly its equator failed. A child thrown from a wild dance whose scar could be the Pacific Basin. And the image still tempts because it looks like memory etched into geography. But calculations tore it gently apart by showing the spin required would have been fatal to stability. And the scar does not match the child, which does not end the idea so much as teach it humility. And humility is what keeps ideas alive long enough to evolve. Capture proposed that the moon formed elsewhere and fell into Earth's lasso, an elegant crime that leaves the thief with a partner rather than a prisoner. And while capture happens through the universe in smaller forms comets captured, Trojan asteroids shepherded, the mathematics of capturing something as large as our moon without smashing it or flinging it away makes this scenario stingy with probability. And yet the mind keeps a corner for it, because captured moons exist around other planets, and because Earth's early atmosphere and tides were intense and could have robbed an interloper of energy. Which is a reminder that unlikely is not the same as impossible when the stage is 4.5 billion years wide. Co-accretion tells a gentler tale, the moon forming in place from the same circumterrestrial disk of dust and rock that fed Earth as both grew, siblings eating at the same table with different appetites. And this would explain the chemical kinship without demanding impact. But it struggles with angular momentum and with the moon's lack of iron compared to Earth, a poverty that asks for a furnace to have separated metal inward before the crustal rocks went outward. And the furnace returns us to violence. Our instincts prefer to domesticate, which is both human and unhelpful. A tension that makes the giant impact attractive because it allows both kinship and trauma. Myth kept pace with these arguments by telling them out loud long before physics had instruments. And if you listen to Polynesian canoes naming the moon as a fisher of islands, to Greek hymns that treat it as a witness to oaths, to Chinese legends of a woman fleeing gravity by drinking elixir and regretting her lightness ever after, you feel the mind rehearsing scales it will use later for science. Cause and consequence, symmetry and cost, permanence achieved through loss, and above all time as a partner whose contracts must be kept. And those contracts are why ritual calendars and burial chambers attend to the moon with such devotion. Because time yields only to those who carry its terms with care. The tidal work the moon performs on us is a low song that never ends, a slow drain and return that sculpts coasts and quickens estuaries, and might have braided early life into rhythms that made complexity easier to inherit. And while the popular notion of strict lunar control over biology overreaches, the subtler truth is that a companion that moves oceans will move anything sensitive resting within those oceans, including early membranes that learn to keep their shape by listening to cycles, and that listening is the habit every later listener imitates when pointing telescopes at nights that are not as quiet as they seem. If the moon edited our shores, it likely also edited our axis, a governor that keeps Earth's tilt from meandering into extremes where seasons would become erratic troublemakers. And this stabilization is a cousin to all the other quiet gifts a large satellite gives to a spinning world. The kind of gift myth dignifies as guardian and science calls constraint. And this double naming matters because it prevents us from taking guardianship for granted, just when climate and tide and schedule ask again for respect, which is to say that origin is not memory alone but policy. And policy is best set by those who understand how the house was built. So we step from story to sample with minds trained by both, prepared to hear in rock the echo of old epics, and in epics the premonition of modern measurements, because the only honest way forward is to let them test each other gently, to permit the moon to be both nurse and remnant, both school and scar, and to accept that our explanations will change as our instruments do, which is comfort rather than threat if we love the thing more than our idea of it. And the instruments did change in a single human lifetime to a degree that would have terrified and thrilled our unrecorded teachers. Because when rockets began lifting questions into vacuum, the moon arrived not as a symbol, but as a place. And places answer differently than symbols do, which is where we go next in the quiet company of dust. Return to laboratories that know how to handle wonder without breaking it. The first footprints laid into powder older than continents looked clumsy and decisive. A choreography by men dressed as insects walking on radiated glass while the whole world held its breath. And beneath each step lay a library that had waited out the eons with better patience than any monk. And when samples came home, the moon unscrolled its book in pages of basalt and anorthosite and breccia, rocks frozen in epochs whose names would become the new liturgy of graduate students who learned to read crater counts like annals etched by hail. Those rocks told a story with two voices, one a series of ancient eruptions that filled basins on the near side with iron-rich basalt, pouring out while dinosaurs were still only possible, and then growing quiet long before mammals considered narratives. And the other, a crust made from feldspar-rich flotation, a foam of plagioclase that rose from a global magma ocean, and congealed into brightness while the interior sorted itself by density like a patient apothecary. And between these voices ran veins of KREE, potassium, rare earths, and phosphorus geochemical bookmarks that radiated heat and encouraged mischief in patches. A mischief that might explain why the near side was so fond of lava while the far side withheld. Instruments left behind listened as the moon shook, and when meteoroids punched the surface or the thermal breath of lunar day and night flexed crust back and forth, seismometers heard a ringing that lasted longer than expected, a shimmering that made headlines about bells and hollows. And while the poetic version still travels, the explanation is its own enchantment. A dry, fractured crust transmits certain waves with low damping, letting energy skate for long minutes in a world with no water and little atmosphere to smother it. A world that reveals composition by tone, which made the moon as musical to geophysicists as it had always been to poets. Orbits sharpened from guess to grace, as spacecraft mapped tiny swings in speed caused by mass concentrations hidden under the seas, maskins whose gravity tugged at paths flown too closely, as if insisting on being acknowledged. And later, the Grail mission would turn the whole moon into a relief map of invisible weight, showing networks of dikes and the bones of old basins and the thickness contrast between hemispheres. A cartography of density that answered questions nobody had yet found the words to form, and in answering provoked better ones, which is what good maps do when they love their travelers. Chemistry placed its fingertips on what oxygen isotopes had already whispered, finding not only similarity, but near identity between Earth and Moon in elements whose ratios act as a signature of birthplace, a sameness strong enough that Theia could not have been a wanderer from the far birthplaces in the solar nursery, but must have grown in the same feeding zone as Earth. Or else, the collision must have mixed their vapors so thoroughly that arguing about parentage becomes futile. And this is where the giant impact evolved into its hotter cousin. Scenarios where Earth briefly wore a rock atmosphere, and the moon condensed out of that bridal veil as if refusing to leave the party entirely. In such high-energy models, the Synestia appears a toroid of vaporized rock surrounding a molten planet, a structure as temporary as a breath and as consequential as a war. And inside that donut rock behaves like cloud, and cloud behaves like sea, droplets condensing into clumps that become a moon, while the rest rains back into the planet it fled. And one of the gifts of this image is not certainty but capacity. It can accommodate the near-identical isotopes and the low iron and the angular momentum we observe, a triple that older models handled awkwardly, even as it raises fresh puzzles about how such a brief structure leaves long signatures for us to weigh. Water entered the conversation as both suspect and witness, because the old wisdom painted the moon as bone dry, baked of an ocean that boiled its volatiles out into space. And yet, as instruments teased hydrogen from mineral spectra and sniffed polar, shadows where cold keeps its contracts better than sunlight does, the moon admitted to reserves of ice in craters that never see day, and to hydroxyl sleeping in volcanic glass that was once sprayed like confetti. And these revelations complicate any origin that insists on total purification, which is a complication worth loving for the way it replants subtlety into a story that had drifted toward the simplistic. The far side's extra crust, a thickening like armor that kept lava from surfacing where it may have wanted to, demands its own origin story, and models propose that Earthlight in the aftermath of impact kept the near side warmer for longer, retarding the formation of insulating crust there, while the far side cooled quickly into thickness, or that convection patterns shepherded KREEP to one hemisphere, like a merchant preferring a familiar port. And in both cases, the lunar face is an expression of initial conditions written into topography, a fossil of asymmetry that will remain, even if all our models trade names. which is how fossils work when they like being consulted. Eclipses returned under new management as we sent instruments to watch them from space, and during a total lunar eclipse, the satellite becomes a sampler of Earth's atmosphere, painting itself red with our scattered sunset and recording the signature of our gases in that bloodlight. And while this is tangential to origin directly, it underscores the moon's vocation as a mediator, a surface on which our planet writes its messages and then reflects them to our instruments, a quiet job that myths assign to scribes and messengers and modernity to spectrometers, roles that agree more than they argue. Amid such elegance persist anomalies that keep the conversation tender, like the question of how the moon's early dynamo generated a magnetic field strong enough to magnetize rocks billions of years ago, when the present moon is weakly magnetized and lacks the core vigor we associate with living fields, and whether impacts can substitute or whether the core convected in youthful exuberance before quieting, and like the wonder of the South Pole lichen basin, a gouge so vast it reaches toward the mantle, and may have rearranged the moon's interior like a chef reaching for spice. And each anomaly resists being tidied away, because it may be the crack through which a better model will enter. The moon's age is a braid of methods rather than a single clock, crater densities calibrated by radiometric dates from specific flows, zircons older than the first continents that carry memories of the earliest crust, and most recently minerals so ancient they push the timeline of crust formation toward an almost indecent youth for a body that endured such trauma. And this youth sits uncomfortably beside models that want long cooling, which is to say the book remains open to corrections in pencil, written in polite margins. And the politeness is crucial because abrupt confidence closes more than it invites. And behind the instruments, the human face remains, less grand than the questions, and yet the only face that asks them, a face reflected in helmets and in black and white images of Earth rising above a horizon never meant for us. And that image reminds us that origin stories are never entirely about their objects. They are about the cultures that write them and the futures those cultures are trying to shape. And the moon's origin matters because it anchors our own, because it calibrates our intuitions about violence and care, about what can be built after ruin, which is why we listen for the next round of answers with the patience of tides that may yet say more. The act of modeling a collision you cannot witness requires a patience close to art, because every variable behaves like a character with secrets, and small changes in spin or angle make new dramas in molten stone and vapor that a supercomputer renders as, whether in the language of mechanics, and in these performances the culprit named Theia acquires habits we can test. If it was roughly Mur-sized, if it struck at a glancing blow, if Earth already spun quickly, then the angular momentum budget, the chemical homogeneity, and the size of the resulting moon fall into a plausible range. And plausible is the best word a storyteller of origins can hope to earn. But plausibility is not identity, and the isotopic sameness that first led to celebration continues to haunt. Because if the moon records a mixing so thorough that both bodies erase their differences, then Theia cannot have wandered far from our orbital neighborhood. And some propose that the inner solar system was isotopically homogeneous over scales we did not expect, while others argue that Earth was never homogeneous to begin with, that our mantle carries hidden regions, those low shear velocity provinces detected by seismic waves, whose chemistry differs enough to masquerade as Theia's persistent shadow, and the suggestion that fragments of a lost planet sleep at the base of our mantle is audacious and tender, a conjecture that asks us to listen to our own interior for clues about a face in the sky. The moon's own interior remembers in molten scribe marks that are still legible if read at the right wavelengths. A fossil magnetism retained in cooled flows under a thermal skin too thin to erase it, implying a dynamo in the past that was livelier than mass alone would predict. And the creativity of suggested engines is a joy. Core convection, amplified by precession, mechanical stirring by Earth's tidal grip, shock magnetization by impact plasma that briefly turned the surface into a storm. Each idea stretching familiar physics into an unfamiliar costume in order to match rock that refuses to lie, which is the kind of refusal a good origin needs to stay honest. Understanding the moon's crustal asymmetry has become its own cottage industry of wonder, with models that heat the near side by earthshine in the immediate aftermath, keeping the insulating plagioclase from thickening there, and others that send the magma ocean's last dregs that creep reach soup toward the near side by the gentle shove of a giant basin like South Pole Aitken, creating a hemispheric conveyor, and even one that argues for two impacts, Theia and a later one that spun the crust into contrast. And while no single scheme commands the room, the crowd agrees that early conditions mattered more than late, which is another way of saying beginnings write in a script that endures. A different frontier of origin whispers from cold craters that never see day, those polar traps where sunlight's angle is stingy and heat cannot make obligations it cannot keep, and the volatiles that gather there, water ice, carbon dioxide, even rarer guests, carry not the story of formation, but of delivery, of comets and asteroids, and outgassed vapors burying their news in darkness. And decoding the chemistry of those ices may yet tell us how wet the inner solar system was at different times. A context we need to understand the moon's dryness and Earth's rivers. And this context is not ornament, but boundary condition, which is the kind of condition that quietly rearranges propositions. Some of the most fragile mysteries hide in the data that feel personal, like the way the moon edits our days in increments we barely notice, lengthening them over eons as tidal friction trades Earth's spin for the moon's retreat, an exchange that moves our companion farther away at centimeters per year and slows our planets. Rotation with the indifference of a metronome. And this trade is not origin, but consequence. Yet consequence structures origin by setting the budgets models must close. And if you want to know how hard the collision was, you ask the clock it left behind. And the clock answers reluctantly and accurately if you consult the fossil records of coral growth rings and sediment tides like a polite librarian with a million-year catalog. From the theater of our single moon, the mind glances outward to ask whether we are typical. And exoplanet surveys return curiosity by showing that large moons are hard to detect, but not necessarily rare. That worlds bigger than Earth often crowd close to their stars, where tides riot and disks, shear and collisions must be common. A universe where giant impacts are not exceptions, but weather, which means our origin story may be the genre rather than the specific. And if the genre is common, we can prepare ourselves to read alien skies where moons stabilize obliquity or stoke tides, or simply grace nights with a second lamp, a possibility that tastes like both kinship and estrangement, which is how truth usually tastes when it is new. As usual, where wonder exceeds certainty, embroidery grows at the edges in the form of speculations that are too charming to ignore, even as they are too thin to trust. Stories of hollow moons sung to life by Apollo headlines, misheard. Of artifacts peeking from craters and images burdened with compression. Of resonances that announce design rather than geology. And to handle these with care is to adopt the same posture that we use for myth. To treat them not as truths, but as desires mapped onto stone, and then to honor the desire while correcting the map, which leaves the map better and the desire unshamed, a balance that keeps curiosity healthy. Even in the correction, the moon keeps a few riddles that science enjoys more than it admits, like the problem of the late accretion tail after impact. That fraction of material added after the core formed which left iridium and other siderophiles in inconvenient places, or the suggestion that the so-called late heavy bombardment was not a single spasm, but a drawn-out taper of collisions that graded slowly into calm, a revision that recast the early solar system's mood from crisis to slow negotiation. And slow negotiations are the crucibles where subtle structures can form, which may be why life waited for a lounge rather than a furnace to unpack its kit. If the moon is a partner in our climate's composure, it is also a critic of our ambition, because its record of impacts on its face is also a weather report about our neighborhood's tempers, a report we can only read by calibrating crater counts with known dates and then extrapolating, a process that is precarious yet necessary when designing futures that presume a certain quiet. And in this, we are like temple keepers of old engraving eclipse tables, trying to persuade chaos into contracts by learning its grammar. A grammar that works better when sung with humility, because grammar without humility becomes law, and laws written for the sky rarely flatter their authors for long. We end this segment with a realization that feels like a vow, that the moon's origin will remain a moving target that sharpens as our instruments do, and that accepting this motion without impatience is the only way to keep truth from retreating out of shyness. And shyness may be the moon's most enduring trait, a reluctance to show everything at once that has trained us to love inference more than proclamation, which makes every night a rehearsal for the next experiment, and every myth an exercise in remembering the questions as beautifully as we can ask them. You can wait for a standstill the way a garden waits for a season, slow nerves aware of changes, too patient to brag. And that is how the evening opens on the ridge, where timber gives way to stone, and stone gives way to air, a place chosen by hand centuries ago that aligned twin towers with the moon's northern extreme, as if threading a needle. You get to use once per generation, and standing here you can feel those hands, the sure way they assumed someone would wait long enough to learn the trick, which is the kind of confidence that builds nations quietly. The moon climbs with the long diagonal of a dancer, returning to a step rehearsed decades ago, and the notch between towers receives it, a white coin sliding into a purse, designed both to catch and to release. And there is a moment when hundreds of years latch with a click you can almost hear, the light stamping a seal on a geometry, both fragile and stubborn, and nobody speaks because the silence is not decoration, but part of the instrument. A silence that acknowledges we have been given a measurement that loves ceremony without requiring it, which is the most generous kind of measurement there is. On nights like this, the far debates about Synestias and isotopes feel very near, not to belittle myth, but to complete it, because watching the moon find its mark at an extreme, none of us can feel, is simply a different way of believing that origins matter, that beginning states send ripples forward long enough to affect us now, and that what we do with those ripples is our only authority, a soft authority that asks us to keep our schedules with stones, with instruments, and with one another, because a schedule is a promise kept to what you love when nobody is watching, and someone always is. The wind returns with that dry twig smell it carries in late summer, even when the calendar insists it is spring, and the moon's minor waver on the horizon, the shimmer from air layers dreaming at different temperatures makes you think of modelers adding jitter to their simulations, so that a planet does not become a tyrant of numbers. And in that shimmer lives the truth between, the place where myth's personification and physics parameter meet without a quarrel, acknowledging that both are ways to keep faith with a world too large for a single method, which is why we come out here, away from screens and toward distances we still have to earn. A gentle alarm on a watch marks the instant when Earth and Moon slopes make a perfect chord, and you look down at the instruments that have been listening while your eyes have been worshiping, and the magnetometer shows a steadier calm than it did an hour ago, as if satisfied the appointment was kept, and the small camera that watches the stars for occultations records a grazing pass by a bright point you will identify later. And the ledger you keep in your head adds a line that is not about data, but about the continuity that data make possible. A continuity that is the only way origin stories borrow authority from tomorrow instead of from yesterday. Eclipses live elsewhere on the schedule, but in their memory, the moon's light feels oddly conditional, even when full, a lamp lit by a candle we cannot see, because it is there by permission and not by right. And you remember how a total eclipse turns the moon the color of iron in water, a blood-warm note that is simply physics doing its job while myth does its own. And the shared competence comforts, because competence is what makes mystery sustainable, leaving awe intact while removing anxiety, and in removing anxiety, the mind relaxes into a curiosity that keeps returning, which is the only kind worth cultivating. Standing at a place where alignment has been kept long enough to be trusted, it becomes easier to think about the parts of the origin story still hanging fire, the precise energy of the impact, and the mixing that followed, the residence time of a rock atmosphere, and the details of a dynamo's youth, the delivery of volatiles into pits that sleep forever. And you realize the questions have become beautiful in their own right, not as puzzles to dominate, but as landscapes to live with, and that a society that loves these questions is already safer than one that prefers answers that clang, because clanging answers close doors that alignment begs us to leave ajar. The moon moves past the notch, and the night begins to feel ordinary again, which is the best compliment darkness can pay, because our senses are good at making home out of strangeness when given permission. And the permission comes from continuity, from the way stones keep their promises, even when people forget. And if origin is about trauma surviving into care, then this is the care part, the unglamorous maintenance of a rhythm you do not own, but are allowed to join. And joining makes you a better host for the next question, which may arrive disguised as an uneventful night. On the way down the path, you notice bright basalt underfoot that the day disguised and the night restores. And your mind walks the route from these rocks to laboratories where their cousins gave up oxygens, ratios and irons grudges and water's arch memory. And from there to simulations where Theia is not a myth, but a variable whose values we learn to narrow without losing wonder. And you suddenly love the way the moon lets you think in both languages at once, elder and modern, story and spectrum, and to move between them without translation, which is the closest thing to fluency we will ever have. The ridge grows quieter as the air cools, and the towers become silhouettes that mean less to cameras and more to eyes. And the moon keeps going as if nothing happened, which is fair, because nothing did if by something we require applause. And yet everything did if by something we mean a rehearsal kept faithfully across centuries by people who will never meet and who would still understand each other by the candle of some shared geometry. And in that understanding, the origin loses its urgency to be solved and gains its power to be companioned, which may be the more faithful way to tell the story at last. Before you drift into sleep, remember mystery is never truly lost. only waiting to be found. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more relaxing ancient mysteries, and let your curiosity guide you deeper.